All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Pfeiffer. Welcome to Conversations on Retail. It is a beautiful day in Northwest Arkansas, and we are so excited to welcome Brand Elverston back to continue his series focused on asset protection and risk mitigation. The series has really taken off. Brand's had some incredible guests that have created a lot of exposure for this series, and we're excited to see it grow. Today, Brand welcomes our friend David Riedman. He's the Director of Industry Research and Content for ZeroEyes. Just a couple of housekeeping issues as we get started this morning. First, we want to recognize all of the series sponsors. We're so grateful for these folks that have come along and have made this possible. Our friends at Barcoding, at Everseen, Rapitag, OcuCon, and our newest sponsor is actually ZeroEyes. And so we're looking forward to learning more about ZeroEyes through this conversation with David today. In case you missed it, Brand has put up quite a body of work in the last year with us, and you can check out all of his conversations on our YouTube channel. Simply go to youtube.com/@conversationsonretail. And by the way, if I might, the conversation with General David Petraeus, retired U.S. Army general, is absolutely sensational. If you've not seen it, you should definitely check that out. The next thing is we want to remind everyone that this is intended to be a conversation and not a presentation. So we hope that you will actively participate. And you can do that simply by clicking on the Q&A button and submitting your questions, your comments, offering insight. Again, clicking on the Q&A button right there in Zoom, and you can join the conversation. The last thing is to remind everyone that the opinions and recommendations expressed by the experts leading and participating in the discussions are their own and not necessarily those of Conversations on Retail. So before acting on those opinions and recommendations, make sure that you always consider their suitability for your own unique circumstances. So with that, Brad, I'm going to turn it over to you and David.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, David. So a couple of things. I want to do a quick intro for David. I first started seeing David's comments on active shooter statistics on social media, primarily LinkedIn, some time ago, and clearly was overwhelmingly impressed that we get some quantitative data around an assessment and getting our heads around this uniquely American phenomenon of active shooters. David recently joined ZeroEyes, which is one of our sponsors, as Matt said, and the premier provider in the space of advanced warning for active shooter threats. So David, do a quick rundown on your background, aside from what you already do, and kind of, it leads us into our first question. What brought you to becoming the notable researcher on this phenomenon?
Well, Brad, thank you so much for having me. And I'm really an accidental gun violence researcher. This was never an area that I thought that I would get into. My career in emergency management started in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. That led me to work in FEMA for a few years, where I worked on disaster planning, mutual aid response, resource typing, kind of thinking about natural disasters. But FEMA sits within the broader umbrella of homeland security. And so as my career developed, I expanded into science and technology, intelligence, working at watch centers. And through there, I got an opportunity to attend the Center for Homeland Defense and Security's program at the Naval Postgraduate School, where I got a master's degree in national security affairs, and then was back at the Naval Postgraduate School for a 16-month think tank program on emerging homeland security issues when the Parkland shooting happened. And even though I had been working across emergency planning, intelligence, homeland security for almost 15 years at that point, I had never heard a discussion of school shootings and really mass violence in the context of being a national level homeland security issue. And from there, I started researching school shootings, found that there was very little data available about them. Really, people's assumptions about what a school shooting might be, why it's happening, is what was driving planning and driving the school security space. And so for the last 5.5 years, I've put a lot of time and effort into creating a large data set that's now informing policy around school security.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know about your Naval postgrad, so have to tip the hat to you. That is no small feat for the non-veteran, non-national security listeners that are out there. That's a pretty big deal. So you have an abundance of data. So correct me if I'm wrong, that clearly your sweet spot is in the K through 12 or the school shooting database. Is that measurably different than what you're seeing if you dip your toe into, say, for example, retail risk or DoD risk on military bases, movie theaters? Is it unique, the data set, or is it pretty much transferable across industries?
Yeah, that's really what brought me to ZeroEyes, is that in the same way that before 2018, there was no really objective data on the characteristics of gun violence on school campuses and on the characteristics of the deliberate attacks on campuses. That's information that is really not readily available across all different types of public spaces, businesses, retailers, infrastructure, transit, wherever else. There are reports that come out from some different government agencies every year that kind of roll up some summary statistics. But if you wanted to know how many shootings that injure 3 or more people that are a deliberately planned act happen on Saturday afternoons in commercial spaces, that's not information that is really available anywhere. And so that's one of the things that I'm in the process of doing right now, is taking the methodology from the school shooting database and using that to construct a large data set so we can start understanding the characteristics of shootings in public spaces.
Yeah, and I know you get this, and of course, a lot of our listeners are going to be retailers. That understanding, my background, obviously 22 years at Walmart corporate, and the first time we really started talking about active shooters was probably, I'm going to peg it somewhere around 2007. And it was my good friend, he's now a senior vice president over something in that space at Walmart now, Larry Lundeen. And I remember Larry talking about, he was the chief of our safety division at the time, and I overheard conversations about active shooters. And I got to admit, David, I was, 2007, most of my strategy effort was around shrink loss that is all over social media now. And I remember saying to myself, and I'm okay admitting this, I'm like, seriously, dude, that's where we're focused when we have this mammoth shrink problem. And so now, here we are. And I have to say to Larry, you were way ahead of the curve. But I got to believe that the data, David, that you put out and that you're starting to push out on social media is going to be a factor in assessing risk at those major retailers. Now, they're not going to come out and say it, understandably, but the intelligence that you're putting out there is immensely valuable to those retailers to assess, to say, what is our real risk? Because having lived in the belly of the beast, that is something that is done all day, every day with everything that poses risk to a pandemic way before COVID. That was a big deal. How do we react to the bird flu back in the day? What are our protocols going to be in all, 4,500 U.S. stores, distribution centers, et cetera? So I say that because I want the audience to, number one, understand, and the retail listeners, that you are a great source of data that, as you just stated, is not readily available, to help them do that risk analysis and understand what is our real risk. If I'm Target, for example, and I'm going to guess 2,000 stores, what is the risk to me that I am going to have an active shooter event? And upstream, it goes into their monetary risk, to their insurance premiums, to their reaction or technologies they may or may not deploy. All retailers, not just Target, everybody. So what is your data in a nutshell? What has it revealed over time? And I guess really where I pegged the insanity is Columbine in, what was that, 1999, so almost 25 years ago. What have you seen over time? What's your data telling you? Is it worse? Is it anything, notable to mention over the data set?
Yeah, it's interesting that you talked about 2007 as when you started paying attention to active shooter, because that's actually when the term first originated. There was active shooter isn't something that existed before it was kind of defined in that space. And in that period between 2008 through the 2010s, with incidents like Sandy Hook and the Parkland shooting and the Aurora movie theater shooting, that kind of template of a person who's in a public space trying to kill as many people as possible reinforced that label of an active shooter. Now, what's interesting and really applicable to retailers now is things have swung so far from that point that now every time gunshots are fired in a public space, the first thing that people think is there's an active shooter. Police are dispatched for an active shooter. If a facility has an active shooter plan, they go into that. But looking at now about 800 different incidents in public spaces from just the last couple of years, the majority of shootings in public are either spontaneous gun violence, which would be a escalation of a dispute. Nobody intended to shoot someone that day, but in the heat of the moment, they fired shots.
Yep.
Also, targeted violence in public, where somebody, might have a restraining order at home, might not be able to get anywhere near their former spouse, but they know that person works at this specific place and this time. So they go in and kill a targeted person in public. Those are the majority of types of gun violence in public, but they all get lumped in with active shooter. But the idea that somebody is killing as many people as possible in a public place, didn't start in 2008. It didn't start in 1999. Really, the first modern active shooter was in 1966 at University of Austin, the tower shooting there. And there were 49 people shot in that incident. And then, through the 70s, just looking specifically at K through 12 schools, which are really my area of expertise, in 1974 at Olean High School in upstate New York, there was a very similar incident to the bell tower incident where an honor student who was on the rifle team shot 15 people from an upper window of the school. Just 5 years later at Cleveland Elementary in Southern California, there was a woman named Brenda Spencer, and she became famous for not liking Mondays and wanting to liven things up. So she shot at 11 people at that elementary school, firing from her bedroom window. About a decade later, in Stockton, California, there was a shooting at an elementary school there where a guy who had a lot of mental health challenges, he was vagrant, he had frequent police contact. He thought that school was responsible for all of his issues. And he set a van on fire with fireworks next to the school. And when the students evacuated, he shot 37 people. That's 1989. And then even, the year before Columbine, at Westside Middle in Jonesboro, Arkansas, 2 students committed what we would think of now as a complex coordinated attack, where one pulled a fire alarm, eliciting a response in the school. When students started evacuating, they were in the tree line and started firing down at students who were evacuating. That was the year before Columbine. So with K through 12 schools, there have been deliberate attacks that would fit kind of our template for an active shooter pretty much every year since 1966. And looking across all public spaces, that same period has 192 different deliberate shootings with 4 or more people killed. So this is a problem that extends beyond this decade.
Yeah, that I'm not old enough to actually remember the Texas tower shooting, but I do have some older friends that do remember that. And then if you think about the coining the phrase "going postal," and I don't distinctly remember when that was, but that was the first. Was it after 95? Do you remember when that postal shooting happened?
There was the concept of going postal came out of through the 1980s and 90s workplace shootings, mostly in factories, logistics facilities, warehouses, things that kind of had remedial tasks. And the thought with going postal is that somebody is stuck in an endless loop of work, and it's kind of driving them crazy to the point that they just go into the facility and shoot as many coworkers as possible. And what's really important there is that a paradigm was changed in the way that major employers and government agencies think about problem employees. And that's, if you have a problem employee who seems to be violent, what you want to do is get that person out of the work environment and into some supportive counseling and mental assistance programs, because you don't want them coming back to your workplace to shoot at random coworkers. So making that investment into making sure somebody doesn't escalate into a threat became kind of commonplace at large companies in the 90s.
Yeah, and it's real. If any, when I was a director at Walmart, and unfortunately, in the course of business, you have to terminate people. And there were times when, everybody's kind of saying it without saying it, that I'm concerned about this, because the termination event itself this isn't going to go well. And you have corporate security people outside the office door in case something goes physical in the meeting. But it's one of those things you unfortunately always just have to think about. Over that, let's call it, let's peg it at about 25 years, have the methodologies or reactions or strategies changed over time? You mentioned, of course, Texas back in the 60s, but here we are today. And I'm assuming the count of active shooter incidents we've had in 2023 exceeds the number of days in where we are. Do you see any meaningful change in mitigation measures or strategies aside from technology? But what does a school do? What have you seen?
Yeah, across both schools and public spaces, in the aftermath of Virginia Tech and Sandy Hook and Aurora Theater, this idea of having an active shooter plan, active shooter training for all of your employees, for all of your students, really became commonplace. And what's interesting and also really troubling then is that active shooter attacks, deliberate attacks, are almost always committed by somebody that has a direct connection to the place that they're attacking. At a school, they're a student or a former student. At a workplace or a public place, they're a frequent customer, an employee, a former employee. So they are learning the plan. They're being taught the plan. And where in the 1980s or 90s, you might not know how people are going to react when you start shooting. Now shooters plan for those reactions. They know that if I pull this fire alarm, people are going to go this way. They know that if I fire a shot, people are going to shelter in place. And we're in this now paradoxical situation where we're simultaneously training people what actions to take, but also we're training a shooter exactly where people are going to go, exactly what police are going to do. In the case of a school, what the code words are, what your safe rooms would be, what teachers are going to say. The student knows all of those things. And it's really clear from both the recent shootings at schools as well as the averted plots that they are being planned based on the security procedures that the school's taking.
That's a really good point, David, that I honestly hadn't considered. I mean, run, hide, fight, pretty much everybody, that's their strategy thus far. Some schools put in, metal detectors that, not to be debated here, but kind of raises a question mark for me on what that's really going to do. But, it's much like, and again, our listeners are broad spectrum responsibilities for risk mitigation, so they'll understand this too. That's not a whole lot different than shoplifting or the malicious intent losses that happen in stores. They understand what we're going to do. They understand the technologies. They understand the dollar thresholds when they'll probably trigger a different response, i.e., if I'm doing fraudulent refunds, I know I've got to stay below $50 if I don't want to show an ID. So, I stay under $50, and I know if I go over $50, they're going to ask me for X, Y, and Z and probably deny it. So we'll just wear it out below $50. So that makes perfect sense. As tragic as it is, the early warning signs, let's kind of get into the psychology of the shooter. And one thing I've learned from Dr. Adam Langford at University of Alabama, they don't plan to survive. So to say we're going to prosecute these guys, it's life imprisonment, it's almost absolutely irrelevant to whether I, as the shooter, choose to do that or not. It is not an effective deterrent, much like organized retail crime. They're not fazed by anything most retailers are doing in the store, short of a SWAT team standing there guarding the crest white strips. What are the characteristics of the active shooter and some of the commonalities that you've seen in the data?
Yeah, so an active shooter in the sense of somebody that is going to a public space or a school with the intent of killing as many people as possible, it's not a spur of the moment act. It's something that's very deliberate, and the place that it's happening is very intentional. And so when we think about, well, if you fortify my facility, that's going to deter somebody from attacking it. Somebody's not thinking of attacking places at random. That was kind of the post 9/11 soft target terrorism mentality, that a terrorist group is going to be looking to do maximum damage, and they're going to do it at the most accessible place that they can do it. That's a completely different ideological ground from the kind of the active shooter, where it's somebody that feels like they've been wronged and they have a serious grievance. And they take that grievance and it becomes directed at either a space or people. And it could be a store, it could be a mall. In a lot of the cases, it's a school, because this school is something that's highly personal. And the active shooters tend to be late teens, early 20s. So they're people that have had very recent experiences, and most of their formative experiences are associated with that school. So it's not that there are no guards at this school, so I'm going to go to this one. It's that I have this unresolved crisis from years and years ago. In the case of Uvalde, it went back to physical and sexual abuse in fourth grade, and taking that fourth grade classroom and having a grievance that built and built and built for a decade to eventually direct violence back on that classroom. These are attacks that are highly symbolic and highly personal. And so it really doesn't matter how much security there is, what fortifications there are. As you said, the person is attacking because it's symbolic. They feel they have no other choice. It's their final act. Really, the number of people that they kill is immaterial. They want to be killed during the act. It's a public suicide. And when we think about something as a crime of despair that's based on years of trauma, then we think about the way to identify and prevent that act from happening is not fortifying and adding armed security. It's identifying people that would have those feelings and have those grievances towards your facility.
Perfect segue. Let's talk about what most, I would say, tier one retailers already do. And I kind of mentioned it before, but they already do employee assessments. Now, whether it's super cool and sexy and it's AI driven and, they can tell if David's going to be a high risk employee. But I had a call actually yesterday with a firm out in SoCal, a startup that's in that business of helping manage risk through a number of metrics that the retailer already collects to paint a picture that you have a problem with this person, potential problem, of course, because we know that in an unnamed retailer, the shooting event that they had was an assistant manager. There were, according to the press, there were advanced warnings that should have been heeded from employees complaining about this manager, et cetera, et cetera. So, hindsight's always 20/20. If you stitch it together, it's almost like, how did you miss this? But as we well know, in the terrorism space, we miss a lot of things. Countries miss a lot of things. Do you see, without mentioning any particular provider, do you see AI firms or more advanced artificial intelligence that is making real headway in that space to help us be able to predict, at least in the employment? That doesn't stop Billy Bob from going into the Texas Walmart and lighting them up. I get that. But do you see any that are out there that are encouraging, that should be more in the mainstream than they are, that help assess risk?
In terms of behavioral analysis, I'm not aware of any, just because, any time that you're going to have AI models, they're going to be dependent on having a huge amount of data that goes into having accurate inputs and outputs for your AI model to be built on. And, there have been 192 shootings in public places that killed 4 or more people. There are a couple thousand more that killed, 1 or 2 or 3 people.
Just this year.
But we have millions, hundreds of millions of people that have been employed during that time period. And lots of them have all kinds of risk factors. They might have substance abuse. They might have depression. They might have prior suicides. They might have recent divorce, family issues, financial issues. And really, a mass shooting is not about a linear connection between those behaviors, but a cluster of dozens of different problems. And each one of those problems is contributing to, if you imagine the person as a balloon, the balloon is just getting blown up more and more and more. And you don't really know which one of the puffs of air around it is going to be the one that causes it to pop. All you can show is that there are all of these different problems coming at this person from a lot of different directions. But there are also millions of other people that never direct all of their issues into violence. And that's why prediction in this space is so difficult.
Yeah, in an oversimplistic analogy, if the big social media providers and, X, formerly Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, they can predict pretty well what David and I are going to look at. And, you can read all about that in the news and shaping the message, disinformation, et cetera. That something we looked at years ago from actually an aerospace provider, Lockheed, was a software program called Wisdom. It's still out there. And back when flash mobs were the thing, where you'd get a bunch of high school kids come in and just tear up the store. Yeah, they might steal some stuff, whatever, but it was more about disruption than physical harm or threat. And Wisdom was helping retailers do that, being able to say through all of this internet chatter, it would be able to detect the sentiment in broad social media digital exchanges, rather than just picking out a word search like the word kill or killer by itself is concerning. But if in the context it says, David, you're wearing a killer shirt today, then it would not flag that. And that it had to be after 2010 that I went to Lockheed and looked at that. And it's still a product. I'm not, in that space much anymore, but to help them be able to get ahead of these risks. And it was interesting that it was Lockheed Martin. So obviously something was going on in DOD to make that a thing.
And with the randomness, of a flash mob or, retail crime where people are looking for opportunities, where people are communicating, it seems like there are a lot of opportunities for that sort of analysis. What's interesting about mass shootings and school shootings specifically is that when they're not random, when they're plotted for weeks or months or even years, that student or that employee is telling other people about their issues, about the problem, about turning towards violence. And what we really need to do is set up better systems where coworkers, other students, friends, relatives have a non-criminal pathway to get somebody who they think is going down that pathway to violence into some sort of assistance program. Like looking at the Uvalde shooting, the shooter was in internet chat rooms telling people that he was thinking about a school shooting, telling people that he was going to commit this school shooting. He was known as school shooter in some of these chat rooms. And looking at the records now, there were other users who were saying, where does this person live? How do we get in touch with the school? How do we get in touch with somebody? But there were no resources whatsoever where a random person somewhere in the country or somewhere in the world can say that I think this user is having a problem. We need to track him down. Post 9/11, if that was somebody talking about committing a bombing, the FBI would have traced that within hours. And I think the most disturbing thing about the Uvalde shooting is that these chat rooms that he was in was on an app where he had registered with his driver's license and his cell phone number.
Wow.
So all we needed was to connect the pieces, have people given a pathway to let authorities know that there's a problem, and we can prevent a lot of these shootings without having to do any broader, detailed analysis, because the warnings are overt, like the clues are right there.
That's a really another good point you bring up. After 9/11, the focus of the FBI, understandably, was not domestic U.S. threats. You can read any national security blog, and that's, some of the contributors outside of what we're talking about that has allowed some of things that have happened since then to occur that pre 9/11 probably wouldn't have. Like you said, if they saw all of the Uvalde chatter in pre 9/11, possibly that could have been a different reaction to be able to say we have a problem, dedicate some agents to figuring that out and work the backstream and get to the story and identify this potential event. If, in your mind, on the active shooter, and you've walked us through pretty good background on what's in their head, some planned years in advance. What do you think, I don't want to get in a rabbit hole on this one, but clearly it affects all of us. I don't know about you, David, but when I go into any store, since I live here in Bentonville, largely Walmart, I'm always keenly aware of who's in the store, and I'm looking around and I understand where the exits are. It's unfortunate, but that's the environment we live in, to the awareness. If I go to Starbucks and I always want to sit with my back to a wall and I'm keenly aware of the one or two exits, maybe. Do you see this spilling over into, it's almost into duty of care? So when you do have an active shooting event, at what point do you feel like legislation is going to be enough to say, retailer X, technologies are available, a range of technologies are available, from the guys in Philly all the way to, acoustic detectors that are used broadly in the UK, for example. Do you see duty of care creeping up to help nudge these property owners, if you will, to do more, or you think we're still a ways from that?
It's tough to tell what the legislative time frame will be. I think what will become increasingly apparent to people is that the shooting at your property is going to impact the bottom line. And there are shootings in public occurring every day. Like, for example, there have been more than 60 shootings at grocery stores just since July that I've tracked for ZeroEyes. And these are not deliberate attacks to kill as many people as possible. Almost all of them are escalations of disputes between customers. Shots are fired in that fight. The shooter almost always flees immediately. Everybody in the store thinks it's an active shooter. The police get called for an active shooter. Now you have a massive police response that's going to close that entire shopping center down, search every single square foot of the shopping center. The store is going to be closed for the rest of the day. Customers who hid in the freezer or the storeroom for 2 hours are going to be traumatized. They're never going to come back to the store. And now what was a fight between two people and the shooter left within seconds, has now shut down your store for the rest of the day, maybe multiple days, had a profound impact on customers and employees. And if it's a grocery store where you have, perishable fruits and vegetables, meat, seafood, not to mention in the chaos that a lot of things may be damaged or stolen also as everybody's running out of the store.
Yeah.
Now that one shooting ends up costing you potentially millions of dollars. And now that there are technologies out there, for example, with ZeroEyes, if you have an existing CCTV system, there's a gun brandished, even if it's in a fight, immediately police can get an image of the shooter. Your corporate security can get an image of the shooter, and you can start piecing together that, wait a second, back the footage up 10 seconds. There are people shoving, somebody pulls a gun, and then we see this guy leaving. Well, now this turns into a regular crime scene investigation. Police have been investigating shootings in public for 70 years now since we professionalized modern policing. A regular shooting investigation doesn't close a business for days. And what I think is going to matter to retailers especially is that there is an increasing amount of gun violence in public. Most of it's not targeted. And if you can figure out what's happening, scale your scope back, then you don't need to have these massive disruptions that cost sales, have extended closures, traumatize customers, employees, and impact your entire business.
Yeah, I'll offer a little bit. When you said millions of dollars, it's easily tens of millions, because all major retailers. So let's go back to your inflection point you mentioned earlier, Katrina. All retailers that participated in any kind of support, be it supplies, be it generators, whatever, to help, all of them knew exactly what they spent to do that. And the same thing with if David walks in the store and slips on some grapes that are on the floor, we retailers know exactly what that costs us, to a point where there's usually a reserve saying that, okay, this happened. Typically we pay, $25,000 minimum. So we're going to reserve that, kind of like a Christmas savings account. So when 6-8 months later, when David says, oh, my back, and then, a year later he says, oh, now it's my neck, we know what we spend on that. And, I cannot imagine the dollar figure on El Paso or Uvalde. And you never hear about that, if I'm a retailer and at a tactical level, you close the store, you can easily calculate the projected sales you would have expected that time period. But you cannot quantify the brand reputational damage, i.e., does Brand Elverston feel safe going to that store again, even though it's in my neighborhood? Probably not. Maybe totally irrational, but I'm just, I think I'll go to the other one. And in the community, the reputational damage in the community, the trauma of associates, the counseling, the insurance premiums you're paying that you may not have to pay so much if you have mitigating technologies that would help prevent these sorts of things or minimize. So they know exactly. And I would say, conservatively, it's tens of millions per incident. By the time
just
you get
an
through.
Example of that I think, you'd probably have a lot of context around is, here in Florida, in Tampa, at, one of the suburban big retail malls that had just been renovated, like $200 million renovation to make it a flagship mall, 244 different stores, plus 100 or so different restaurants and food vendors at the mall. And right in the middle of a Saturday, this was in August, Florida has changed the laws for better or worse, but now anybody can carry a gun in public really without any training. Mm-hmm. So a woman was paying for her food in the food court and reached into her purse, and she had a handgun just loose in her purse and accidentally fired a round. And this is in the middle of the food court. So people hear the gunshot, thousands of people start running, and everybody's yelling active shooter. That turns into a 6-hour police response at the mall, closing every single store. And then because of the trauma to employees and customers, they ended up keeping the mall closed on Sunday as well. So now you have a 244 store premium shopping mall that, because one person fired a shot in the food court by accident, is now closed for 48 hours. I mean, the cost of that, and not being able to realize that that's an accident immediately, because if you have acoustic gunshot technology, if you have visual gun detection technology, you're going to know whether you have one shot that's an accident, you're going to know whether you have two shots that are in a fight, or you're going to know whether you have worst case scenario, complex coordinated attack, multiple shooters coming in every direction. You're going to know those things in seconds. And from there, you can decide your operational posture. And when there's one shot and it's in the food court, what you need to do then is calm people down, and you don't need people hiding in the closets of 244 other retailers.
Yeah, it's a, and I years ago, before I went to college, I was a police officer, a deputy for a couple of years. I majored in criminal justice, always been my thing. Went on active duty, was an Army officer for 12 years. To this day, if I walk into any public forum and I see a gun holstered, and I don't see an accompanying badge or something that traditionally would say, oh, that's okay. Maybe it's just me, but I'm like, that just doesn't settle. It is, it's one of those things that for the customers in a store, depending on the demographic you're in, now certain parts of the country may be open carry, everybody carries a gun because they're all ranchers, or that's okay. You go into Bass Pro, for example, somebody is returning a long gun. Happens all day, every day. But for somebody like me, if I'm in there shopping and I see a guy walking in with a shotgun, the first thing in my mind is not going to be, oh, probably a return. It's going to be, which way is the door? So I have a question here that popped up from one of our listeners that is along these lines of, at what point do you say, retailer, I have X technology provider, just like you're required to have a fire extinguisher every 50 feet, you're required to have safety glass. The front doors of all stores have got to be pushable where you can bust out of them if there's a fire. You have to have fire alarm, sprinkler, all that stuff that's been around, David, that judging by your appearance was probably a law before you were born. Why do we not do that today? So let me read this question. So it's irrelevant who it comes from. So similar to COVID, the period over 3 years ago, do you believe this would help increasing online sales, saying that we have technology and publicly admitting that to avoid going to the stores? Or do you know if there's already available any correlation between those events and driving sales to e-com? So the way I'm reading that is that if and most retailers probably wouldn't do this, say we have ZeroEyes or we have X, Y, and Z. Okay, it's kind of revealing your cards, like you said before, that the shooter knows. So if I'm a shooter and I see the active shooter XYZ vendor placard on the front door, is that going to cause me to go elsewhere? Maybe, I don't know. But I think the question is more, and if I'm reading this wrong for the submitter, please resubmit, but do you know if there's any correlation between those events, an active shooter event, of course, and increasing online sales after an event? So after a El Paso, after a Uvalde or such. Do you have any data on that says, yeah, typically you get a spike in online because they're afraid to go to the store?
That would be a fascinating peer-reviewed article for somebody to write, because I'm sure that a lot of that information, may be available. Getting specific online retailers information might be difficult to show that, but there are some pretty robust studies around the economic impact of school shootings in jurisdictions that show that a school shooting controlled for all of these other variables and looking at comparison zip codes, that a school shooting in a zip code decreases the single family home value by more than 10% in that zip code, because once there's a school shooting, other people don't want to bring their families to live in that community. I'm sure that if one could find data around retail sales and comparable online retailers following shootings, there's a good chance, that might be the case as well.
That's a really good point. With kids in school, I witnessed a non-injury car accident a few days ago. And anyway, talking to the family on the side of the road that they homeschool. And it's interesting that, when I said, well, okay, that's cool, but, I didn't say it quite this abruptly, but basically said, why do you do that? And he said, well, it's a couple of things. One is, that's most concerning is exactly what you and I are talking about, David. We're in, Northwest Arkansas. I wouldn't consider it rural, but there are rural parts once you get outside of, Bentonville or Springdale, Fayetteville, the Metroplex. You can drive 15, 20 miles any direction and you're out in the country. So they are concerned about that with their kids. And it's unfortunate, and I have another close friend, mentee, that has kids, and he's talked to me about that. It weighs heavily on him every morning when he drops his little boy off and the little dude trots into school. He's like, I can't help it. This is how I have conditioned myself that's always on my mind. When I was a kid, the hardest thing we had to do is get smacked on the playground or hiding under the desk for nuclear fallout reactions in the early, that was mid-'60s, and then it pretty quickly went away. So there are a lot of intangibles that are associated with this. And if a researcher like you or others that pull all that together to give you what we call in retail total loss. So it's not just the bottle of Coke that left, it's the violence that was associated with that and how many potential sales did we lose because they're afraid to come in the store because they know blah, blah, blah. So
yeah, well, a great example just from my personal experience of that is growing up in Montgomery County, Maryland, the serial sniper attacks in 2002, the very first person shot by the serial snipers was at a gas station on Georgia Avenue in Kensington. And that gas station went out of business. Even though that shooting had nothing to do with the gas station, the victim was completely random, the shooters were caught within 3 weeks, people never went back to that gas station again. And that's just one example. But especially with retailers, if you're a grocery store and there are dozens of other grocery stores, if you're a shopping mall and there are plenty of other shopping malls, one adverse event is the only thing that people need to do to change their behavior. People go to the closest grocery store because it's the one that's most convenient for them. If there's something that emotionally connects that grocery store to something they worry about, they only have to drive 90 seconds further in most cases to go to a competitor. And that's, something that really is not quantifiable, but most certainly if you talk to people in any community, you're going to be able to find examples. And I've done a look at some of the highest fatality mass shootings that have occurred. And in a number of those, the place where the shooting happens never reopens. And some of those were really flourishing businesses like the Pulse nightclub here in Orlando, where I live. That was a very busy, very successful nightclub. And after that shooting, that business no longer exists. It's now a permanent memorial. That is a worst case scenario, but it is very true that something that's completely out of the owner and operator's control can change the trajectory of their business and their life forever.
Yeah, so is there a difference? Do you see a difference in preparation of a facility type, be it a mall, school, hospital, military base, airport? Do you see protective measures differently by industry, or is it pretty much a cookie cutter?
I think they're very different by industry. People bring up the example all the time of, why don't we secure schools in the same way that we secure airports with TSA? And we made a decision after 9/11 that we're going to spend a couple $2 billion a year making sure that somebody that is a ticketed paying passenger is able to go through a screening once into an area that is completely secure and every single exit is alarmed and every single person working in that has also been cleared. And we are going to have that protective envelope around the area before somebody gets onto a plane. That's really not viable in a school, both for cost and just for practicality, that people need to come and go, that it's not go through security once like you do at the airport and get on the plane. Across different commercial spaces, office spaces, they're all different in that some places are completely open to everyone in the public. Some places have really heavy traffic. You might have a first floor that's connected to other first floors, that's connected to underground subways, and people are coming in and out of your facility that aren't even customers. And a place like that is completely different from an office where there might be a single client that rents that entire office space and they have their corporate security on the first floor, the way that any of your big tech or Fortune 500 companies do. So all three of those could be public spaces, but they all would have a completely different type of people coming in and out, reasons for them to be there, and ability to secure or not secure that space.
Yeah, in a retail sense, and it relates to the risk of malicious intent loss. The comparison, I responded to a post on LinkedIn, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago. Costco and the warehouse club format is entirely different, to your point, than is a Walmart store, a Target store, multi-entrances, people coming in and out. Sometimes employees at the door, oftentimes not. But you go to a warehouse club, i.e. Sam's or Costco, and one entry exit, always a manned door, bigger product, et cetera. So the solution set now that you're explaining as you have would be entirely different, even in the retail sector. If I'm Walmart, for example, I would do something probably different in my stores, much more fluid environment than maybe I would in my club environment, which has one entry exit. That's it.
And it also depends on, the type of retailer and the type of merchandise that you have. Yeah. If you're a very high-end retailer, you don't want to put any barriers between somebody accessing merchandise, wanting to take merchandise, take in the sense of purchase, and then actually make that purchase.
Yeah.
Because if that person has to stand in line for 2 minutes, they might think about, do I really want to buy this and leave? So a lot of places want to have a seamless customer experience. Other places, if you've got a ton of low-cost purchases, a convenience store, so on, it's fine to have one clerk. Because if people abandon a couple purchases because the line's too long, if people shoplift a few items, that all is a lower bottom line than having a second employee working there.
Yeah, it was Marvin Ellison, CEO of Lowe's, made a pretty pointed comment, which is very unusual from a C-suite executive, that the solution to the rampant theft that's happening in stores is payroll. You got to have people on the floor to provide that active deterrence. And in the same light, in the broader risk mitigation component, if nobody's on the floor, then to report, hey, I see X, Y, and Z, then that could be a black mark force multiplier, if you will, to allow that event to unfold. So I got another question here, and then we got 7 minutes. So let me do this one. What are the key differences in shootings you've seen in the 2000s as opposed to the 1960s and possibly even the 90s? How have the warning signs changed during the past decade, or have they?
Yeah, schools are what I know the best in terms of that 6-decade study. Mm-hmm. And you could take a shooting from the 1970s, strip out the date, and it would play exactly the same way as a shooting today. And I think that's really important for analysis, because a lot of the things that get talked about on cable news around social media or changes to society or changes to the household or whatever else, you can really take the shooting from 50, 60 years ago, and it's almost the same as today. What has significantly changed in the last 10 years is the type of weapon used, and that's both in public mass shootings and in schools. is the wide availability of the semi-auto rifle and being able to quickly reload detachable magazines means that there's a much higher fatality count and overall body count than there was at prior incidents. Thinking back to the incident that I talked about in 1998 at West Side High in Arkansas, those students had shotguns and 22 rifles, and they were firing from 50 yards down at the students. And there were 5 killed and 10 wounded. If both of those, teenagers had kind of your modern AR style rifle, that probably would have been dozens of people killed at that school. So I think the biggest difference is the type and availability of weapons, and then also that the shooters know the plan, and there's a predictable plan at every facility. And 30 years ago, a shooter would just be guessing about what they think is going to happen. But now the shooters have literally been taught what's going to happen.
Yeah, very good point. More lethal weapons that are available today than they were in the mid-last century. I got another good question, and then I'm going to close with one more for you. Any data on the variation of risk based on gun or no gun zones to include, and I'm going to add this to the question, most retailers have a sign, no guns, right? Does that matter? And open carry laws across the country are very different. Do you see any, even if it's, theoretical correlation of it's an open carry state, so we see way more active shooter events than we do in another state that's not? Do you see anything there in the data?
Yeah, that's a question that I've actually thought quite a bit about, and I'll probably write something about at some point. But the idea of the gun-free school zones came out of 1990 legislation that was really tough on crime legislation that existed, from the 1980s. And it was a way to have a felony charge if somebody had a gun somewhere near a school, because that was really a way to roll up people that might be involved in other criminal activity.
Yeah.
But looking at school shootings, there are 20 years of school shootings, deliberate attacks, before that legislation was passed. And with the most deadly, with the highest fatality shootings at schools, about a third of them were before Columbine. So before 1999, about a third of them were from 2000 to 2015, 16, and a third of them have been from 16 to today. So the incidents were always occurring. There have been deliberate attacks every year. What's really changed is how many people are getting killed in them, but not necessarily that there's something that changes with other people having weapons around there. What retailers really need to pay attention to, and this is, the ZeroEyes data that we're collecting, is there are shootings that are taking place every single day in public spaces, in malls, in shopping centers, and they're almost all disputes that are escalating between people. So just on Monday night, there were 3 different shootings at grocery stores, and those were all escalations of disputes. And if there are more people that are armed, then you're more likely to have a situation where what might have been pushing and shoving turns into a gunshot. Once something's a gunshot, then it quickly spirals into your full active shooter response.
That's a really good point. And, being careful not to get into outside of the scope of our conversation, but, the more guns necessarily, in my mind, is not a safer environment because, with my military background, there's very precise training on firearm safety and engagement and accuracy, et cetera. And you always question that on open carry. If it's open carry, any Billy Bob can grab a 357 and strap it on. And the emotional intent is very different in a non-hostile engagement than hostile. And that's one thing I think a lot of the civilian sector maybe misses in suggesting open carry. And if everybody's got a gun, it's going to be awesome because they'll take care of that before it gets out of control. There is that emotional component. It's very distinctly different. And I attribute that to military firearms training because they go through that even back when I was there. So we have 1 minute. David, let me close out with this. What's the headline from your research, everything that you've done, if you had to do an executive summary and say, this is what I didn't expect maybe the data to tell me, but here's what it tells me. And I think maybe you've already mentioned it, but I'm not going to steal the show. Go ahead and answer that.
So every active shooter attack, every deliberate attack in public is purposeful. And because of that, there are weeks or months or years of warning signs. And if an employer or a friend or a coworker is able to identify those warning signs, those deliberate attacks can be stopped. On the flip side, the majority of shootings in public are spontaneous acts of gun violence, and we're treating all of those like an active shooter. And by treating those as an active shooter, we're creating far greater consequences and huge impacts to stores, retailers, schools, students, customers that really don't need to be treated in that way.
Okay, I've been just told we got to end because they got another session coming. David, thank you so much. This has been extremely informative. I really appreciate it. And to our listeners, this will be pushed out on social media, the post recording, so you can listen again at your free time. So thanks so much, David. Greatly appreciate it, man, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Take care.